Hello, everyone. Welcome into the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. I'm Alex, obviously, and today we are going to be talking about the next video in this free agency series I'm doing. Last time we talked about Kaiser White and the linebacker room and how that could be affected by how the franchise views Kenneth Murray. Today, I want to be talking about the secondary situation for the Chargers in free agency, which free agents they have, which free agents they could replace those guys with, and of course, are there potential avenues to go through the draft as well? So first, let's start by talking a little bit about the cornerback free agents that the Chargers do currently have, in their kind of situation on the roster, right? So guys that are probably projected not to be back in when we talk about 2022. You have Chris Harris, who obviously kind of has had a very up and down Chargers tenure. I would say it's kind of mostly been down, coming from the level he was at in Denver. Going to be entering his age 33 season. We'll talk a little bit about his 2021 season and if there's any real potential chance he comes back. But we'll discuss that in a bit. Ryan Smith is the other Chargers corner who's a free agent. He was signed last offseason to sort of fill their gunner position, help them out on special teams. Unfortunately, was doing a good job at that until he tore his ACL in the Eagles game. Was actually starting at cornerback in that game, which was crazy considering the injuries and the COVID situation that the Chargers had at the time. But Ryan Smith, now entering his age 29 season, off of a torn ACL, probably not going to be playing that same gunner role next year, I would imagine, for the team. Of course, as you look at his AAV, he's very inexpensive relative to some of the other Chargers free agents. So it wouldn't shock me if the Chargers brought him back on a deal that's between 1 and 2 million, much like they did last year. But I do think the ACL tear, particularly how late it was in the season in November, I think that could probably affect the Chargers' thinking in terms of what they want to do with Ryan Smith going forward. But there's always a possibility that he's back because the Chargers kind of do need as much help on special teams as they could possibly get. And then I will also take us to the safety room, where there's not really a lot of action going on compared to maybe what people would think. The only Chargers free agent safety is Trey Marshall, which we'll see in a second when this stupid piece of shit loads. But Trey Marshall has a salary of $835,000 as an unrestricted free agent. Obviously was brought in after cuts last year. Kind of played a variety of roles for the team, was on the field whenever, some safeties were injured and out. It didn't work when he had to play a lot. Obviously had some, help on special teams as well. But yeah, kind of an interesting year for him. I don't think there's much of a chance that he's back, although he kind of was connected to Staley in that series of signing guys like Trey Marshall and Eric Banks that he knew from other places, and they were cut by other teams, and the Chargers picked him up to try to kind of revitalize their careers a little bit and get some depth. But if I had to guess, obviously, I don't think Trey Marshall is much of a part of the plan for the Chargers going forward in 2022. So then that makes me want to talk kind of about how their roster is currently situated, right? Let's pretend Chris Harris isn't coming back for now. You really have a secondary in terms of cornerbacks. That'll be Michael Davis, obviously, at one of the outside corner spots. Right now, you would probably have Tavon Campbell start at outside corner 2. Obviously, you could put Asante Samuel Jr. there, but Asante Samuel Jr. is probably more of a natural fit for the nickel role than the slot corner that Chris Harris was playing. Asante Samuel Jr. is going to be a guy that, is all over the field when it comes to this kind of stuff. He's not just going to be, set to one corner position and that's where he's going to stay the entire game. I think that we saw that in 2021 as well. But he does make more of a sense on fit for the slot corner fit than the outside fit, just considering the guys he'll go against and the type of defender that he is. So that really kind of leaves the Chargers needing an outside corner here. And I think that that's one of the things that they'll have to address in free agency or the draft, right? We've talked about how loaded the draft is with guys like Sauce Gardner and Booth and McDuffie, et cetera, et cetera. And those are the kind of guys that the Chargers could potentially get. I don't think they have much of a chance for Sauce Gardner as he's kind of quickly rising up the boards, but there will be cornerback talent available when the Chargers do pick at number 17. So that could be very well be the pick for them at that time. So, we'll talk we'll talk about that bridge when we cross the bridge when it comes to the draft. But first, I do want to talk a little bit about Chris Harris Jr., who, was sort of one of those guys that was signed on a 2-year deal, right? When the Chargers missed out on Tom Brady, we talked about Linval Joseph and also Brian Bulaga in this capacity. They were on these short-term deals because the franchise didn't really know what it was doing. After Phillip Rivers obviously leaves the team, they miss out on Tom Brady and then give out these contracts to kind of like bolster the depth. And if you actually look at the Chris Harris numbers, they're probably not as terrible as you would think based on watching the Chris Harris film a little bit, or if you've watched the Chris Harris game, given the, completions and critical moments that he did give up. Chris Harris wasn't that terrible, but still pretty bad. And I think the trend that you'll see here when it comes to Chris Harris specifically, talking about from his Denver days, is that Chris Harris did dip a lot in terms of his coverage and overall defensive grades. When he left Denver, I think he was about a 70 overall cornerback. Of course, that was more of a situation where I think he finished in Denver by playing the outside as opposed to the slot, but had a pretty good year. Obviously comes off one of his, best final years as a slot corner in Denver with an 85.5 overall defensive grade. But since then, that's dipped to a 61.9 in Los Angeles, injured last year, and a 62.4 this year. Obviously also was injured, and there were COVID situations and all of stuff that was all over the place, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think Chris Harris is kind of washed at this point. I think he's hit a decent floor for like what he might be able to do for a while, right? You have seen that his grades haven't like completely plummeted, although, he's gotten kind of worse as a tackler, worse overall in coverage, as you can see the difference between the Chargers years and some of his other seasons. And, it just doesn't feel like it's necessarily a wise investment to bring him back. If the Chargers really can't find anything in free agency and maybe they really strike out in the draft too, that could be a situation where I could see Chris Harris potentially getting re-signed on like a 1-year deal. But ultimately, I think with the youth movement the Chargers want in the secondary, I think with the fact that they're going to spend potentially high draft capital on a cornerback, and I think the fact that they probably will be players for, a couple corners in free agency as well, that takes Chris Harris out of the picture, in my opinion. And it was always meant to be that way, right? When we talked about those short-term deals that Telesco gave out in 2020 after they missed out on Brady, it was always meant to be, kind of short-term for Joseph Harris and Balaga and all those guys that were signed in that time. So I don't think Chris Harris was quite as tremendously bad as maybe the perception is on Chargers Twitter, but did have a pretty high missed tackle rate, definitely declined as a coverage corner, and it's probably time to cut the cord, in comparison to what the Chargers, maybe would think about doing with Chris Harris. So it's been weird to see the media talk about Chris Harris as a guy that's a must re-sign for the Chargers at 33 years old. I don't think he is in that category of players the team needs to re-sign much at all. So now that we've kind of talked about all of the Chargers corners and safeties that are free agents, I do want to talk more about around the league, what's available for the Chargers. So as you can see, the Chargers are kind of going to be operating in free agency and in the draft with a secondary that is Michael Davis, Tavon Campbell probably on the outside still currently. Asante Samuel Jr. obviously is a very pivotal piece, and that's kind of their secondary with some of the guys that they have backing them up there, but that's really their depth. So let's talk about the safety market first, because I think the safety market is a little bit interesting. Tyler has made a bunch of videos on this channel talking about Tyrann Mathieu and some of the connections there. I don't know if that happens, but there is an argument for it to potentially happen. Obviously, he is a pretty big cap casualty in Kansas City. It's looking like I think there's a limited chance that Matthews ultimately brought back there. So that kind of puts them in a position where the Chargers, if they wanted to spend some money and pair him with Derwin James, they can. But the Chargers safety opposite Derwin James, other than Nasir Adderley, just like hasn't worked. They haven't really gotten the value out of some of those later round draft picks like Alohi Gilman that they might have wanted, or Mark Webb. And so I'll be curious to see if they really want to go after Tyrann Mathieu and sort of jeopardize the development of Nasir Adderley a little bit. Obviously, you can still use Nasir Adderley, but I do think making a Mathieu Derwin James pairing and this Brandon Staley defense would kind of make it so Nasir Adderley is a little bit phased out in a sense, which would kind of be interesting based on the direction that the previous coaching administration clearly wanted for Nasir Adderley at the time. There's, I think Tyrann Mathieu is like the big money option they could pursue. Marcus Williams is obviously a guy from New Orleans, and New Orleans is in cap hell all the time now for the next couple of years. So we'll see what they do there. Marcus May is kind of a upside guy that I like from the Jets a little bit if they wanted to pursue that direction. My guy Rodney McLeod had a pretty good year this year, as you can kind of see, but indicated by some of the PFF numbers. He, had one of his good years in pass coverage and is obviously a good run defender when we talk about Rodney McLeod as well. I don't know if the team's ultimately going to bring him back, but I think when you start talking about these kinds of safeties, you're probably talking about 1-year deal guys that can produce on that contract as well and just fortify the depth, maybe in a sense behind Nasir Adderley as opposed to getting a safety that's going to blow up the market. Jesse Bates is the guy from Cincinnati, but I think everyone kind of expects the Bengals to franchise tag him considering the year he had. And they really need him. Devontae Casey, guy who picked off Herbert in the end zone. Unfortunately, I still have that in the back of my head as a bad Herbert throw, but he's available, and his teammate, I think Jaron Kearse, is going to get a lot of talk in Dallas as a free agent that is available at this time. And then you have Jaquiski Tart from San Francisco, who I think could be an interesting fit as well. But the safety market, I think, is a little bit interesting because the Chargers can kind of look at a number of guys and a number of different types of options. If they want to go spend big money on Tyrann Mathieu and Devin McCourty, or Marcus Williams and all these guys, they theoretically could, but they could also spend, a little bit more smartly on some of these cheaper options that I think provide some value, right? Better value than. Let's talk about the cornerback market now, which I personally do not think is nearly as good as the secondary market. I think J.C. Jackson is going to be a guy that gets a lot of discussion from Chargers fans. I've seen hype about him, but he'd be very expensive, and I think ultimately there's probably going to be a team that kind of overpays for him in value compared to what the Chargers could get. Also, isn't like 100% like necessarily a scheme fit a little bit. I think there are some question marks there regarding JC Jackson, but we'll talk about that in our kind of free agency primer episode, I'm sure. But other than that, you have Darius Williams as a guy from the Rams. It's obviously going to get a significant pay bump as he hits unrestricted free agency, and the Rams are kind of a team that has to operate in cap hell now as a Super Bowl champion, right? So that'll be interesting to see what decisions they make there. But aside from that, it's Stephon Gilmore. If you want to give him $15 million at age 32, I will pass personally. And then you have a lot of kind of guys that are going to probably operate on 1 and 2 year deals in this free agency class. You have Joe Hayden, who's 33, Kyle Fuller, pretty bad year in pass coverage, unfortunately, and he's heading into his age 31 season. Chris Harris at 33, Patrick Peterson at 32. I think you get the point, right? So a lot of these guys are a little bit older with some kind of notable exceptions that the Chargers could get some value out of. But personally, I would address cornerback more in the draft in those first 2 rounds and then try to address the safety concerns potentially in free agency with a big signing like Tyrann Mathieu or something like that. Look at our friend Casey Hayward over here. He's heading into his age 33 season. Gus Bradley is in Indianapolis, so I would guess Casey Hayward will probably follow him to Indianapolis. So I don't think you should get your hopes up about Casey Hayward coming back to the Chargers after the year he had with the Raiders this year. So that's kind of my free agency preview when it comes to the secondary room. Let me know what you want to do with Chris Harris. Do you want to sign him? Do you not want to sign him? I know what the answer is going to be. I'm just playing with you at this point. But let me know in the comments down below which free agents the Chargers should go after. Do you see them going after Tyrann Mathieu? Do you see them maybe pursuing a JC Jackson? Let me know who you think the Chargers should get to kind of fill their secondary room and the holes there down in the comments below. And I will see you guys.